Hello everyone, my name is Joel Beckham. In addition to using the Bible, we will be using the textbook by N.T. Wright entitled Simply Jesus, a new vision of who he was, what he did, and why he matters. In this section, we will be discussing pages 1 through 56. N.T. Wright begins this work by stating that Jesus is a very odd sort of king. Jesus was not the king that the people expected. He wasn't like the monarchs of old who sat on their jeweled and ivory thrones, dispensing their justice and wisdom. Nor was he the great warrior king some had wanted. Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem a few days before his death is one of the best known scenes in the Gospels. But what was it all about? What did Jesus think that he was doing? Western culture bounced back at Jesus the question with which he teased his own followers. Instead of, "Who do you say that I am?" we were asking him, "Who do you say that you are?" N.T. Wright points out to his students, much like you are a student at a university, that you come to the university not to learn the answers, but to discover the right questions. Unless you ask this question of Jesus, "Are you who they say that you are?" your Jesus risks disappearing like a hot air balloon off into the mist of fantasy. It is the question of who Jesus actually was. With Jesus, it's easy to be complicated and it's hard to be simple. Part of the difficulty is that Jesus was and is much more than people imagine. Not just people in general, but practicing Christians. The churches themselves. Jesus, the Jesus that we might discover if we really looked, is larger, more disturbing, more urgent than even the church had ever imagined. We have reduced the kingdom of God to private piety, the victory of the cross to comfort for the conscience, and Easter itself to a happy escapist ending after a sad, dark tale. Piety, conscience, and ultimate happiness are important, but not nearly as important as Jesus himself. We want a religious leader, not a king. We want someone to save our souls, not rule our world. Jesus of Nazareth was a figure of history. That's where we have to start. He was born somewhere around 4 BC and grew up in the town of Nazareth in northern Palestine. Jesus' blood relatives were well known in the early church. If he himself had had a family, we would certainly have heard about it, and we don't. From complete obscurity, Jesus suddenly came to public attention in the late 20s of the first century when he was about 30 years old. Like many thousands of young Jews in that period, he died by crucifixion, a horrible method of killing designed to torture the victim as long as possible. It happened at Passover time, most likely in AD 30 or possibly 33. The purpose of historical research is to discover the Jesus they've been telling us about all along, but whom we had managed to screen out. That will occupy the bulk of this book. Next, N.T. Wright presents us with what he calls the 3 puzzles surrounding Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth stands out in the middle of history. Tens of millions call him Lord and do their best to follow him. Countless others, including some who try to ignore him, find that he pops up all over the place. A line in a song, an image in a movie, a cross on a distant skyline. Jesus is mysterious because what we do know, what our evidence encourages us to see as the core of who he was and what he did. is so unlike what we know about anybody else that we are forced to ask, as people evidently did at the time, who then is this? Who does he think he is? And who is he in fact? The first reason for our being puzzled is that for most of us, Jesus' world is a strange foreign country. I don't mean just the Middle East, a major international trouble spot then as now. I mean that people in his day and in his country thought differently. They looked at the world differently. In today's Western world, it's common for young adults to ask their parents for financial help to get them started in life. If well-to-do parents refuse such a request, we might think them mean. But when Jesus told a story about a younger son asking his father for his inheritance while the father was still alive, his hearers would have been shocked. They would have seen the son's action as putting a curse on the father, saying in effect, "I wish you were dead." And that gives the whole story a different flavor. But if the first reason for the puzzle is that Jesus' world is strange to us, the second is that Jesus' God is strange to us. Part of the reason why Jesus puzzled the people of his day was that he was talking about God most of the time. But what he was saying both did and did not make sense in relation to the God his hearers had been thinking of. Throughout his short public career, Jesus spoke and acted as if he was in charge. That is to say, Jesus spoke and acted with authority. This isn't about religion in the sense the Western world has imagined for over 200 years. This is about everything: life, art, the universe, justice, death, money. It's about politics, philosophy, culture, and being human. It's about a God who is so much bigger than the God of ordinary modern religion that it's hardly possible to think of the two in the same breath. N.T. Wright, next tells us about a perfect storm relating to Jesus' ministry. We can't let the Gospels against the blast of modern... We have to stand up for the truth of the Gospels against the blast of modern skepticism. We can't let the atheists and the naysayers have it all their own way. It's time to roll back the climate of suspicion and once again learn to trust the canon of Scripture, to trust the great traditions of the church, to trust the God of miracles, to trust Jesus himself. We could also rephrase that as it is important to believe in Jesus. That is to demonstrate the faith that we have in him. That's what it means to trust him. To trust Jesus means to believe he is who he says he is. And that means to have faith in him. Here, we find the classic Western Christian myth about Jesus, which is still believed by millions around the world. N.T. Wright presents us with two myths surrounding Jesus. In the first myth, a supernatural being called God has a supernatural son whom he sends virgin-born into our world, despite the fact that it's not his natural habitat, so that he can rescue people out of this world by dying in their place. What we have to realize is that this is a myth because this supernatural being called God did not just one day decide to send his supernatural son into this world to die for us, to rescue us from this place, but it was prophesied, it was announced, anticipated years before in our texts of the Old Testament, in passages such as Isaiah 7:14, such as Micah 5:2. Even the entire passage of Isaiah 53 tells us about this one, this Jesus who was to come and to rescue sinners. The second myth, prevalent in the skeptical Western wind of our perfect storm, is the new classic modernist myth, which is widely believed in secular society and in several mainline churches too. In this new myth of Christian origins, Jesus was just an ordinary man, a first-century Jew conceived and born in the ordinary way. He was a remarkable preacher and teacher, but he probably didn't do all those miracles. Again, we have to realize that the Old Testament texts that we previously referred to show us that this Jesus was not just an ordinary man. It tells us that Jesus is indeed God. As we saw just a few pages prior, the authority with which Jesus spoke was unlike any authority that any human figure had ever and since has spoke with. Either Jesus is God or he's not. You can't have a middle ground. There's no way, based on the evidence, that he is just an ordinary person. And now N.T. Wright continues with looking at the problem of historical complexity. He says, now we are ready to take up the third element in this storm he refers to. He says that the third element is the sheer historical complexity of speaking about Jesus. The world of first century Palestinian Judaism, his world, was complex and dense in itself. We have 1,000 sources on which to draw for constructing a picture of today's problems, everything from newspaper reports to Facebook and Twitter postings. But for historians of the first century, and if we want to talk about Jesus himself, we are all bound to become, to some extent, historians of the first century. We are faced with a strange challenge. We have simply a history book written 40 or 50 years later by a person named Josephus, an aristocratic Jew who went over to the Roman side in the war of AD 66 through 70, and a scattering of other material, bits and pieces, tracts, coins, letters, and so forth. Out of these very disparate sources, we have to reconstruct the setting in which what Jesus did and said made the sense it did. So much sense that some thought he was God's Messiah, and others thought he had to be killed at once. If we don't make the effort to do this reconstruction, we will, without a shadow of a doubt, assume that what Jesus did and said makes the sense it might have made in some other context, perhaps our own, that has happened again and again. And I believe that this kind of easygoing anachronism is almost as corrosive to genuine Christian faith as skepticism itself. Part of our difficulty here, says N.T. Wright, this has been another serious problem he says that he has faced in writing this book. And the problem is that the world of first century Palestinian Judaism was complex and to us often highly confusing. Imagine again trying to explain, in our context, the United States of the early 1960s to a visitor from Mars, or even in whatever context you're in. If an alien from Mars came down and you tried to explain your country to this foreigner. In any particular historical context, certain things made sense, certain ideas and actions went together in a way that felt entirely natural at the time, but that we may well have to reconstruct with considerable difficulty. Sometimes doing first century history, people use this difficulty as a way of saying that Jesus and his followers couldn't have thought like this or like that. If we find a certain idea difficult or puzzling, how could they, poor pre-enlightened souls, possibly have gotten their mind around it? So, N.T. Wright says, how can we go about the task of trying to understand Jesus himself? What are the Gospels? What about these other sources or other so-called Gospels? What sources did these books use, and how can we evaluate them historically? What non-Christian sources are there for Jesus? We just discussed the reference to the Jewish historian Josephus. There's also a reference in the Roman historian Tacitus, and one possible allusion in a more scurrilous Roman writer, Suetonius. how were the stories of Jesus shaped by the needs of his first followers as they went out in the wider world? And what were the motives and intentions of the writers themselves? What can we know about the communities within which they themselves lived, prayed, thought, and wrote? In fact, N.T. Wright says that he increasingly suspects that a good deal of the methods developed within professional biblical scholarship over the last 200 years have been themselves the product of a worldview that may not have been truly open to discovering the real Jesus. Next, N.T. Wright wants us to take a look at what he says the making of a first century storm. He says that it was in Jerusalem that the real perfect storm took place. But in addition to Jerusalem, in addition to that storm in which Jesus confronted the religious leaders of his day, there was also what N.T. Wright refers to as the Roman storm. If you were to ask anybody in the Roman Empire, from Germany to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, at that time in the first century, who the Son of God might be, the obvious answer, the politically correct answer, would have been Octavian. That is, the Roman Emperor. In a world where mainstream religion was emphatically a branch of the state, that is, where the state and the church, or the state and religion were one, Augustus, or the Roman emperor, took the senior priestly roles. He became the Latin word Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest in Latin, and passed that role too to his successors. So we have the Roman storm. Next, N.T. Wright moves on to what he calls the Jewish storm. The second great element in Jesus' perfect storm, the overheated high-pressure system, more turbulent and complex than the first element, is the story of Israel. As far back as we can trace their ancient scriptures, the Jewish people had believed that their story was going somewhere, that it had a goal in mind. Despite many setbacks and disappointments, their God would make sure that they reached the goal at last. This is a story within which many Jews of Jesus' day believed passionately that they themselves were living. They were not just telling it as an ancient memory, they were themselves actors within its ongoing drama. It is hard for people today to imagine what it's like to live within a long story in this way. Finally, he says, the clash of these two stories produced several moments within a couple hundred of years on either side of the time of Jesus. These will be discussed in a later chapter. For the moment, we need to move forward, N.T. Wright says, to the third element in the perfect storm of the first century. Now, N.T. Wright calls this element the hurricane. Depending on where you live in your context, you may be familiar with hurricanes. N.T. Wright says, to understand this great cyclone, this tropical hurricane, you have to understand something about the ancient Jewish vision of God. This was always the highly unpredictable element within the Jewish story itself. God remained free and sovereign again and again in the past. The way Israel had told its own story was different from the way God was planning things. Often God's way of telling the story cut clean against the national narrative. And Jesus believed that this was happening again in his own time. Here then is the third element in the first century perfect storm, the strange and unpredictable and highly dangerous divine element, the wind of God. The wind of God. This is God's moment, declares Jesus, and you were looking the other way. Your dreams of national liberation leading you into a head-on confrontation with Rome were not God's dreams. God called Israel so that through Israel he might redeem the world, but Israel itself needs redeeming as well. So the question is, who is king? N.T. Wright tells us God is that king. He says or writes, as it was, the more the story of Israel went on, the more the ancient poets and prophets spoke explicitly about God himself being king. We have several examples of this in scriptures that he provides for us on pages 44 and 45 of Psalm 10, Psalm 47, Psalm 95, and Psalm 45. He says, we notice a constant triple theme in these songs. First, Israel's God is celebrated as king, especially in Jerusalem, in his home in the temple. Second, when Israel's God is enthroned as king, the nations are brought under his rule. Third, when God is king, the result is proper justice, real equity, and the removal of all corruption and oppression. Well, we have come to the end of our first section, pages 1 through 56. Thank you.